Welcome to Tech Talk Podcasts by CERT's IT Service Solutions. In today's episode, our host, Jon Grainger, invites veteran Cristan Massey, who has a vast experience in IT service management. They will be discussing the topic, is BAU dead in tech and IT? They explored change control, feedback loops, risk management and cultural shift. Let's dive into part one.
Right then, so welcome everyone to the CERT's podcast. Really excited to meet and invite Cristan Massey. We've got the usual slightly provocative title. I think it's like, is BAU and IT dead? And there's probably quite a lot we can discuss around that. But before we get into it, I'd like to introduce you to Cristan. When I was researching you, the summary came up was like sort of IT stroke combat engineer. Now I might sort of be overstating things a bit, but I think I think that the military culture is definitely going to crop up somewhere in the next hour.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, it was probably going to be a topic of discussion within the realms of this.
Cool. And then just for the audience we have, this is a mixed bag. There's people who are technical, non-technical, but there's also folks with a forces background as well, particularly with CERT. So, do you want to give us a little bit of your background, your history, what's kind of brought you to today? But in sort of 30, 40 seconds, if that's possible.
Yeah, I'll try. So I joined the army straight from school and did 7 years as a combat engineer, but also a military parachutist in 9 Squadron RE. And then from there, I decided about 25 that I wanted a career change and ended up joining an ex-forces program. And this company trained me up in relevant areas of IT and business. And then I found my niche, which was service management. And then within the last sort of 9 to 10 years, I've then progressed to be sort of head of positions, sitting in different service management practices, service design, transition, service delivery management, and then sort of head of from there on. Sat in across sort of from managed service providers to enterprise level global organizations to also some startup scale up organizations as well.
Cool. Well, look, I think a lot of that background and experience can be very, very relevant to our discussion. But what I'd like to do is sort of tee up the discussion first of all, before we kind of get into some of the recommendations or experiences. So I think where Louise was coming from when she set this exam question to us, is BAU dead? I was sort of thinking about it, and it seems to be it's aimed towards the speed at which change is coming at us thick and fast, and there's a kind of a BAU sort of focus, which is stability. Sometimes it's called keeping the lights on, is an old expression. But we've got this kind of conflict between kind of stability, but also being fast, given how quickly change is coming. So what I was sort of thinking is the sort of the challenge maybe that we're responding to a little bit is we're going from the kind of traditional keeping the lights on to maybe then trying to keep up, and then in some instances trying to get ahead, because that maybe is the sort of the background. But I mean, from your experience, are you seeing change occurring faster within the sector that you work in?
Yeah, so it's crazy. It's crazy sort of to think about the different things that we've I've had to experience in different industries across the different sectors that I've worked in. Inevitably, everybody is having their own level of what they label as transformation. I've been on multiple transformation projects, and it's keeping up with that curve. That technical curve is we've got, especially in the tech sector, you're moving faster than you can even sort of comprehend. So if you're not moving with that level of transformation, you're behind the curve in whichever industry you're operating in. So it does always have to be a big focus. And yeah, it is quite noticeable.
Yeah, and I think when we get into it, that kind of dealing in a scenario where things can change very quickly and adapting to it is incredible. Very very important. We'll probably jump into some of your military background and the culture, the military culture, because I saw I think a white paper that you'd referred to
Yeah.
on the topic, which looked like a very very interesting topic, which we'll get into.
Awesome.
But if you just think about that, so technology is changing incredibly quickly. There's this sort of cliched saying, which is the speed at which technology is changing today is the slowest rate we're going to experience for the rest of our lives. I mean, because it's changing at such a rapid pace. And I suppose I know it's only a few minutes into our session, Cristan, but I'm going to mention AI. Apologies
No, that's fine.
for everyone listening, because that just crops up everywhere. But that's a kind of another classic kind of accelerant. It's going into the mix. Suddenly we're able to do things quicker. From your experience, what do we need to do differently, or what are you doing differently to try and cope with that kind of pace? On the assumption, Cristan, that we're both going to accept that just keeping the lights on is no longer sustainable. We need a new kind of normal.
Yeah. It for me, the analogy of keeping the lights on is a good one. For me, I don't think we should lose sight of that. So I'm all for the big transformation, staying ahead of the curve, being industry leading, but I implement things within sort of my teams, which I got the phrase actually from a conference, so I'm not going to coin it and say that it was myself, but I've absolutely implemented and used it. Somebody referenced it as brilliant basics. So not losing sight of what your basic things are, especially within service management. No matter how far we progress within technology, whatever the new shiny thing is, whether it's AI, you're still always going to have things like incidents. You're still always going to have support tickets. You're still always going to have a customer and be customer centric in what you're doing. And they should be your basic principles, and then you build upon that. Absolutely have focus to transformation and to the keeping up with that tech curve that is ever increasing, but do not lose sight of sort of the basic principles that you need to, because if that gets missed, doesn't matter how good the new shiny thing is, you're not going to be able to sort of operate. You're not going to be able to keep the lights on, to use your phrase that you used
Sure.
earlier.
I have a sort of a build on that, but to completely agree with you. The way I describe it with my teams is I call it Jam Today. So one of the things you have with all these shiny things, is you can have your team can sort of think about, well, actually, these projects are going to be online in the next however many weeks or months, and therefore we don't need to focus on these issues because they're going to get fixed by these projects. And I try and say, just because a project is there doesn't mean we haven't got the here and now. But
100%.
The jam today is a quote from Alice in Wonderland, and I actually think brilliant basics is much better. To whoever said that in the conference you attended,
It's certainly stuck with me.
Yeah, no, it's really cool, and it's so true, because if you do drop down on the basics, especially in live service, that's what your customers or your users will experience today. I mean, that is literally what they'll take away from the technology team, won't they? That's the reality for them. And so if you lose sight of that because you're focusing on trying to deal with all of this change, or saying it's all going to come tomorrow, the jam tomorrow side of things, you can, if you're not careful, you get that can create a really sort of negative experience for users, for clients, and then ultimately for the team, because teams don't generally go to work wanting to deliver a bad service.
Well, that's it. And the last point is really pertinent to sort of where I see this in the team itself, and the sort of I'm a big advocate of psychological safety and cognitive load as well. So ultimately, if you're not looking at the basics and you are just solely focusing on, we need to do this new line of work, we need to focus on AI, we need to do X, Y, and Z, your technical debt increases. You start building up this sort of problem tickets that are ever increasing, and people don't have time allocated to that. You have your demand and your resource dedicated to this new feature, this new product, this new service, and then when that then feeds into the cognitive load of your team, you've got people like myself that sit in the service management area that are saying, oh, well, actually, I appreciate that you might have this 2-week sprint to deliver this new feature, but we also need you to look at these 20 tickets that are in your queue. And a big part of this, to answer your original query for me, is also resource allocation. So making sure time dedicated to that basic stuff as well, so that the cognitive load of the team isn't 120%. It's probably needs to be about 70, 80%, so that they've got the time for the social interaction and the HR stuff and your people stuff and your learning and development and everything else. So I think that's really important, is that team psychological safety and the cognitive load of the team as well.
So this is really cool, because I think what, we're probably going to increasingly throughout this session talk less about tech and more about people, or sometimes I say less about silicon and more about carbon. But on that resourcing side, you just reminded me there's a book called the Phoenix Project, which is a bit of a book for DevOps and all the rest of it, a few years ago now. But I remember it talking about 4 categories of work. I think it talked about business projects, IT projects, change, and my favorite category, which is called unplanned work. I think you could update that a little bit based on what you've just said. And in the change category, you could put in, leadership, training, development, all the really key things for building a really positive culture. And then just on that other point you said about psychological safety, I mean, we've got so much we can go through on this session, but on the psychological safety, so you can tell I've been in IT for about 150 years. So but way back, I cut my teeth on one of the sort of original sort of management consulting companies, which was called Anderson Consulting back in the day. And I remember being told by a partner. Now, what's interesting is I think the way he delivered it was definitely in an unsafe way as far as psychological safety is concerned. But actually, I think if you put a twist on it, it can be a real positive. So I'll tell you how I retell this to my teams. He said to me, John, good news, 10 points. Bad news, 5 points. Wrong news, P45. Now, that's not particularly safe. It didn't give me I mean, what it told me was, absolutely report what's going on. Yeah. Now, the way I flip that is I never mention P45, because that's a passive aggressive. Well, it's not even passive aggressive, is it? It's just an aggressive thing. Just exactly. But I do think that if you can create that environment where in quotes, bad news is as welcome as good news, because that's how you can't do engineering without a feedback loop. Yeah, it's just impossible. And you can create that in the right way. I think that's absolutely key. When you're leading your folks and you're consciously working on that psychological safety, how do you sort of get feedback on yourself about how you're coming across?
I sometimes do it direct. So I've been a late entry apprenticeship. I recently, last few years, been going through the operational manager apprenticeship. So not your typical 16, 17, and it's been quite rewarding actually. And one of the parts of that syllabus was actually on feedback, and you can do it direct and indirect, and it's sometimes, again, but it comes into psychological safety. It's good to sometimes put people on the spot and say, well, that last project that you've worked on with me, can you just tell me something that I could improve on? Or is there anything that if we were to do it again that you'd want different or better from me? So going a little bit more direct and being a bit abrupt in getting that feedback. And then in a more generic sense, I've got things on the bottom of our team SharePoint space where every page will have a feedback loop. There is a feedback form within our team's area. We always seek guidance when we're delivering presentations or service reviews to gain feedback a little bit direct from there. I think indirectly, though, it's creating the correct environment. I am comfortable that certainly now, this team that I've had, that I've got now, the team before that, they felt comfortable giving me feedback. And if you don't feel comfortable giving your manager feedback, then a lot of that isn't down to the individual, it's down to the manager. So you need to first focus on the environment that you're operating on, which comes a lot to psychological safety, making sure that if somebody voices and challenges something that isn't working or they're not comfortable with, then it's not the correct setup. They need to be able to do that challenge. I've actually got a real an example of this where I didn't realize I wasn't setting the correct space up per se. From probably my military background, my presentation style is quite loud and full on. Let's say I'll go into a room, it doesn't matter what the size of the room is, I'll speak, I'll be quite vibrant at the front, I'll be loud, my pitch will be quite sort of to a loud level. Part of that probably being military, part of that coming up from a council estate in Manchester. So that mix is obviously going to be loud and boisterous. I didn't realize that coming into the room, probably it took this individual about 3-4 months to be able to voice it to me. And it was one of the feedback loops that I alluded to. I had sent them a form to ask for some feedback for myself, and they gave it me back. And he said, "You're an excellent presenter. You're really good at delivering the information. I find it difficult concentrating because of how loud you are when you come into a room, and because I wasn't varying my tone, because it wasn't needed. It was an audience of about 4 or 5, my team at the time, but I was still being as loud as I was if I was presenting to 30 people. They lost concentration. They couldn't focus on the information I was giving them because I hadn't looked at my audience. I hadn't created that correct environment. And I took that feedback on, and I still try to take that feedback on and know that it's something I need to constantly work on. But it's not something that I absolutely never considered. And without that level of feedback, you're not able to create these environments for your teams to work effectively with it.
And Cristan, we'll keep coming back to that and culture, because I think there's going to be a theme throughout this for certain. I totally agree with you. My experience, it's an easy thing to say that you have to adapt your style to different circumstances, but actually it's another thing, A, being able to do it, and B, knowing when to do it. And I think if you do a lot of presenting and you present in the wrong context, it can also feel a little bit like it's a one-way communications. You're sort of basically they're listening to you. It's less conversational. It's really interesting. I just want to mention something really quick, and then we'll dive back into some of the specifics on BAU. We can move around. Yeah, there's no problem at all. But I've got an audio book I'm listening to at the moment by someone called Susan Fowler. And it's one of those things, it's just popping up in my feed, and I'm thinking, how on earth do they know I'm interested in stuff like that? And the title of the book is Why Motivating People Doesn't Work and What Does. I'm just mentioning it because that absolutely caught my eye. I thought, hang on a minute, what a big part of leadership is ultimately motivating folks, for a good cause, etc. And I won't go into it, but it's an interesting one in terms of she really challenges sort of traditional motivations, like financial, or giving people objectives that maybe they haven't completely understood or bought into. And it just seemed to ring a chord to what you were saying earlier, because what she was saying is if you want to motivate someone, there's 3 things you have to do. I'm gonna slightly butcher, her version of things, but it was like understand what individuals' motivations are. So give them a purpose, but it's their purpose, not a purpose you've imposed on them. Yeah. The second one is make a connection. So it sounds like, Cristan, that feedback you had was someone reaching out to make a connection with you, as it were. And then the third one is capability. So understand the capability of teams, because I remember there was a quote somewhere, and this is sort of leaning on your military background, but they were saying, attitude isn't everything. If you can't fly a helicopter, you shouldn't be, trying to fly one. You shouldn't be in the sea trying to, you can kill people if you do stuff like that. So it's kind of those three levels. So let's go back to the kind of, so we've teed it up that, there's a lot of change coming.
Yep.
You've got to do brilliant basics, but actually it's harder than ever because you're trying to get time, not just in your own team, but other teams, to put time aside for that kind of work. So if you think about organizations that are facing all of that change, maybe they've kind of looked up and thought, we need to do something differently here.
Yeah.
What would you say, how do leaders sort of handle this sort of, I don't know if we're going to call it a cultural shift, if that's too but it sounds like it is more at that kind of basic kind of cultural level. So get this balance between, change and stability. What would you kind of go through?
I think there's a lot of factors in terms of the considerations that need to take into effect, rather.
Yeah.
Size of the organization, level of leadership and management that we're discussing, all of this varies, but I think what remains a constant is understanding your risk appetite. The further up that tech curve that we keep on alluding to, the higher your appetite of risk needs to be. There is always that balance of risk versus reward. My area of IT is not the tech side. It's very much, as you can probably work out, it's the people, it's the service side. And I am a lot of the time the mediator between those that are fast flowing, delivering change, wanting to be autonomous, wanting to do the next new shiny thing. Okay, and I'm the mediator between them and the people that are focusing on governance, focusing on the associated risk and managing that risk. And the fine balance that I've had is no longer your let's make sure that everything goes through one weekly CAB board a week and there's no autonomy within the team to deliver that, against sort of, well, on the same merit, we need to make sure that all these changes that are going through, and I've been in organizations where there's hundreds of changes a day, where we still need to have some level of governance, because if there's an incident that occurs, which change caused that incident? How are we going to rectify our challenge? So risk appetite, to answer your question, and efficient change control that is appropriate for the organization and the area that you're operating in. Some organizations absolutely do need to have a more restrictive level of change control. But some of your low level changes, to be constantly making changes to the features that aren't going to have an incredible impact if it was to go wrong, or it can be reverted if it did, is really key.
And Cristan, I was just thinking of the CAB process. So I'm gonna mix up a few things here. But when you have an agile team, one of the things that you're not meant to do as the CTO is kind of lean in, and because you're just going to change the dynamic of everything. Now I'm an engineer. As my computer science is my background, but I'm also a CTO. So I have this real struggle where my engineering side comes up, and I've done this before. I've said to people, look, I'm joining this call as the engineer, not as the CTO, first amongst equals and all the rest of it. But, you absolutely have an impact. Yeah. Even if you say that, you're going to have an impact. So I do that less and less and less. And just bringing that back into the CAB point that you said, I haven't done this recently. I haven't needed to do this recently, but in some contexts, I have sat in and listened to the CAB. I think that's also possibly virtue of Teams and the fact there's lots of people on the call. Now, I haven't listened to the CAB with a view of catching someone out, or that's not been the intention. It's more trying to listen to the nature of the conversations that are going on, because I always think a really good cab is a little bit more ceremonial, where the engineering side has been discussed outside of the cab, and to sort of generally people get, risk and, and because so I'm just wondering whether you've ever experienced that, where you've affected something just by being present, as a leader, we're trying to get this feedback, aren't we? So we can create this psychologically safe environment. But if we're never in it, we don't, we've got to have some kind of personal connection with it. Otherwise, we don't know whether we have created a safe environment.
Yeah, I've done it from a management perspective where I've turned up to stuff like that because they know the stakeholders there are difficult, is probably not the nicest of terms, but challenging stakeholder.
Yeah.
And there's apprehension from people delivering that, to say, well, I know that I'm going to have a challenging conversation, and just my presence there makes them feel a little bit more comfortable in being able to deliver that information or having that conversation. Or if they did get pushed back, at least they've got that escalation point for me to come and say, well, actually, you do need to follow this process, or you do need to refine your change window, or you do need to speak to the customer service team if you're going to implement this, or whatever it may be. And I've done it from that level. A big element of where I've seen it improve, though, is the use of terminology. So even the term cab can sometimes be restrictive, especially for your out-and-out engineers. To have a cab that they need to attend is absolutely like, oh no, why is somebody else from another side of the business reviewing my change that I'm implementing on the system, the area of the website that I'm responsible for? Like, and being on the opposite end of it, not coming from an engineer, I can absolutely see their pain and frustration in doing that. What I've done in some organizations is I've changed the terminology. We had we in one of the organizations, we didn't have change control. We had something that we had labeled as service readiness. Absolutely, we were still doing change control, and we were varying the types of changes. So as per sort of your traditional IT service management, your standard changes were low level, low risk. They didn't go through any sort of service readiness. The teams could go through that. They were still being audited, so if they did cause issue, we could capture that. But then your changes that were having a significant change that held some risk, we'd go through a service readiness process where the associated service manager for that area would get all of the team, all of the different areas together, run through each aspect that you would know, that you would expect from sort of change control. When's it going in? Who have we communicated to? What are the risks? What happens if it goes wrong? How are we reverting it? Everything else. And then the other type of terminology that we changed is that we didn't it wasn't classed as change approval at the end of it. So all the different stakeholders that we had on board and going through the change would look at it for a change review, but there was no acceptance, there was no approval. It was done on a RAG status. So people could say, like, absolutely, this is a red for my area, you can't do it on this, like, it's difficult for you to do it on this time. That would be taken into consideration, but the responsibility would still sit with the team to make them amendments. They felt a lot more in control. The feedback loop that we talked about before was done in such a way that it was constructive, it wasn't negative. It was like, you can't do this. It was like, well, this is how it's going to impact me. It therefore quantified, and then the accountability was still on the person who was doing the change to say, okay, yeah, I didn't take that area into consideration, I'll move it to the right slightly, or yeah, we can involve this team because I completely forgot about doing this aspect of it. Completely allowed us to implement change control in an area in which before they didn't want to do it, just by changing a few words and approaching it slightly differently.
Which is really profound, yeah, because you're back into the carbon rather than the silicon of the situation, and I think there's probably I mean, I don't think any time in my career I've sort of put out a survey at all the engineers and said, "Are you getting value out of the cab process?" It's and also to the service management team and said, are the folks turning up for cab? Are they engaging properly and everything else? And I think it's, if you don't get that right and you end up with a going through the motions process, which I also have seen in risk management. So if my objective is to just get you to approve a change, that's totally different from my objective being, I want the service to continue after I put this change in. Yeah. Because one is, you could say those two could be aligned or should be aligned, but they could also be very different behaviors just to get the cab documented, it was approved. And the reason why I'm mentioning risk is because I think if you're just trying to get the approval, it's the same with risk. People will say, especially, for me, John, I wrote you an email about that risk, or I've put the risk in the register and therefore I'm now admonished of all my sins. It's like a confessional, I put it in the register and somehow someone else is going to pick up with that. So you make sure that the risk management process, which I've found sort of traditionally harder to get people engaged in. The language is also really important, but the meaning behind it, which is, actually, if you run more of your priorities based on risk, it can actually be very rewarding. And I've always seen that when it gets to some sort of critical mass of people engaging in it, it really works. Everyone sort of looks at each other and goes, "Wow, that was one of the top risks which we mitigated." It's actually a really good process. The same with cab. If you were genuinely fascinated and motivated by what it is that the organization's producing, the cab process is a pretty cool place to be, to understand how everything's coming together. If you're a project manager, the cab process can be a really interesting place to listen to what's progressing, understanding some of the blockers from first principles, rather than having to hear it or read it on a report or go to a meeting. You can see some of that. So really, really interesting.